Okay, just a brief preface. So, the point of this video is to present you with something just enough outside your normal moral comfort zone, if at all possible, to make you re-question stuff. I don't necessarily believe everything I'm going to say here in this video completely, in the sense that it's a devil's advocate position, a true, almost literal devil's advocate position, more than anything, more than a steel man argument or whatever they're calling it nowadays. And if you think this preface is a bit pretentious or whatever, well, there's more where that came from in the rest of the video. Part 1. Not entitled to my empathy. Many years ago, I was volunteering with a group of boys, and we were assigned to carry a few heavy objects about the distance of a football field, like water, tables, whatever. And I complained that the object I was carrying was too heavy. I said, "Oh, this is so heavy." I didn't even complain much about it. I just made a snarky complaint comment about it. And there was this one kid who I was volunteering with, one boy who was very impressive and squared away. And he just asked me critically and kind of seriously, "So, do you want me to carry it for you?" And when I heard that, I don't think I've ever been so offended. I said, "No, of course not." What an affront to my manliness to make another guy carry your stuff for you on top of his own stuff because you can't manage to carry it by yourself. But I think that was an interesting interaction. What was evident from that interaction was his statement revealed the vapidness of my complaint, because when I complained, he offered to help, and I was offended that he offered to help. So what was the purpose in complaining? If you want help, ask for help. If you don't want help, don't complain. So there is this one response to complaints that I heard a lot when I was younger. The response is, "Sucks to be you." I mean, this was kind of a common thing to say in the group of guys I was volunteering with. "Sucks to be you." What a wise and necessary retort, I think. I think this retort should be more common. "Oh, you have wet socks, sucks to be you." Or your parents are forcing you to do yard work so you can't hang out, sucks to be you. And so on and so on. I mean, when I was a kid, this was a common thing to say. It's like, "Oh, I don't care about your problems, sucks to be you." And this is exactly as dismissive as it sounds. It's supposed to be. It says, "Your problems aren't my problems. So what do you expect me to do? Performatively soothe you?" I think that retort, it's something I heard a lot in male-only spaces, but very rarely in mixed gender spaces. I think that retort is kind of an example of toxic masculinity. And if you don't understand the value of masculine culture, the value of toxic masculinity, it's because you don't understand the value of the retort above. Like, the same people who complain about toxic masculinity are the same people who will be offended by the phrase "sucks to be you." But I like the phrase "sucks to be you" because it encourages self-reliance. So it says, fix your own problems if you possibly can before burdening the group. Part 2, might makes right. We've all heard of Machiavellianism and of the idea of might makes right, right? The most provocative anecdote, I think, comes from ancient Greece. In 416 BC, Athens invaded Melos, an island in the Aegean Sea, and they offered an ultimatum to the people. They said, "Surrender now or pay tribute and be annihilated." And the people from Melos appealed to morality and philosophy. They said, "You Athenians, you're well renowned for morality and philosophy. Athenians are known for their philosophical dialogues on morality, and now you're being hypocrites." The Athenians didn't try to argue back rationally. They didn't try to appeal to any moral pretext. Instead, they responded that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Part 3, slave morality. The Western modern world is completely consumed by the slave morality of Nietzsche. It is so omnipresent that you don't even recognize it. It's like a fish doesn't recognize water, or people on the land don't recognize that they're in air. It's the implicit cultural affordance. Everyone tries to describe their upbringing as hard, underprivileged, as a struggle. This is why every college admissions essay, which is to say, the essay about "here's why I should be a member of the upper class," this is what it's trying to convey. People from rich and privileged backgrounds tend to be ashamed of it, at least conceal it publicly. Like the rich kid, if you call them a rich kid, they'll kind of be offended maybe. They'll say, "Oh, are you saying I didn't have to work for anything?" Now, there are exceptions to this, but that's the general trend, and it wasn't always like this, and if we go far back enough in history. And the implicit logic seems to be kind of like this. And here's how you could kind of fit it within a meritocratic framework. Not to say everyone who makes this argument likes meritocracy in the first place, but the argument is people who come from less privileged backgrounds had to overcome more to get to their current position, which is more impressive than if they didn't. And therefore, if two people obtain similar results, the success of the less privileged person is more impressive because that person had to overcome more and therefore they're a better candidate. And that's the gist of the argument. I don't know if it's ever taught so explicitly as I've described it. I mean, in some cases I have heard it kind of explicitly as that, but either way, it's not that difficult to surmise. It is assumed that all left-wing educated people kind of hold this view. It's never really challenged. It's kind of the default view. But it wasn't the default view in all places and times. It is a modern-day Western view. Throughout most of human history, the default unquestioned view was a lot more similar to the might makes right idea. If everything I'm saying sounds extreme, then I'll just kind of fall back on the consensus. Oh, I'm just a normal person from pre-modern times. I'm just normal. I can just fall back on that, I guess. But nowadays, in a conflict, everyone wants to portray themselves as the oppressed or the weaker side. For example, let's take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Now, I personally do not care that much at all about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I don't care who wins. But I've noticed something interesting, or even to say who wins is kind of a piece of ignorance. Neither side is going to win. It's just a clusterfuck. But one thing I have noticed is the Palestinians always like to emphasize their underdog position. Say, we are being oppressed by the Israelis. You can't make false equivalences between us and the Israelis. To just call this a conflict as if there are two equal sides, them and us. No, they're so much stronger. They're oppressing us so much more. We are being oppressed by them. Blah, blah, blah. But okay, personally, I don't like underdogs that much. I don't care for it. I prefer the winning side. I prefer to side with the winners. And so if it's true that the Israelis are dominating the Palestinians, whatever, okay, I like to pick the dominant side, right? So other than that, I don't care about the conflict. But that's a reason to favor the Israelis as far as I'm concerned. It seems to me like there's a kind of gendered aspect to this. Like men maybe want to be more self-reliant and surround themselves with strong, dominant men. Women like to make sure everyone's taken care of, even the weaker parties, which would seem to make them more partial to the pro-weak side. Okay, part 4, bitter people case studies. The first person I'll talk about is Bobby Fischer, definitely an extraordinarily accomplished person. But I watched this very telling video of the old, crazy, borderline schizophrenic Bobby Fischer. And at one point in the video, he goes on a long series of diatribes about how he was apparently shafted in some copyright dispute. So some other person or company apparently stole the trademarks to Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess. Okay, look, maybe Bobby Fischer was shafted in whatever dispute he's talking about. Maybe he wasn't, and I don't know, and I frankly don't care. And if I met him then and there, I would tell it to him to his face. I'd say, wow, Bobby, seems like you got screwed. Try reading the fine print next time. Try paying attention to the details. Maybe having your lawyer check that thing over. Kind of stupid of you to lose that trademark. Maybe try standing up for yourself, huh? But, while we're on this topic, while we're talking, you and me, this is such a petty dispute. Okay, you're going to die at 64. How much more time and mental energy do you want to spend ruminating over this? What are you trying to achieve exactly? Are you trying to get people to feel sorry for you? What's your end game here? And it probably would not have had much of an effect. I mean, Fisher spent the rest of his life crazed and annoyed with such trifling things. I mean, his legacy in popular culture is that of a young genius who wasted away later in life into an old anti-Semitic, weird, borderline schizophrenic weirdo. After he stopped delivering what the world wanted, which is chess wins, the world stopped caring about all the ways he had supposedly been wronged, as it should. The world only cares about what it can get from you, and he needs to learn that. Now, let's talk about someone else who I've mentioned a lot on my blog, Eric Weinstein. He has been a partial inspiration for a lot of beliefs I've had over the years. I've probably stolen half the good ideas he's ever had. And a while ago, this large community kind of sprung up around him.
I would have called it a cult, except it was, for the time, extremely tolerant of critics. I'm gonna get this off my chest. I think the community was, in its heyday, quite a marvel to behold. It felt like the average member was a genius just talking to them. And the space felt like an enlightenment salon. Every sort of abstract topic was discussed: politics, economics, physics, math, philosophy, technology, anthropology, cognitive science, all in greater nuance than I could get elsewhere. And maybe it can seem kind of cringe to say all this, but the fact is that people I talked to in real life, none of them had the level of nuance on these topics to what I could get just talking to members of the Eric Weinstein community. As honest as that is, I mean, this is essentially like a Discord where you could hear 200 people all on the same line with each other, no one interrupting anyone else, all talking very civilly about some abstract topic. So it was a high quality community, and it was so obvious that it was high quality that it was almost humorous to remark on that fact. Like, wow, everyone here is so smart. People would always say stuff like that, and it didn't ring hollow. It was actually legitimate. It was true. But naturally, every community has to die off. So this community went through a schism and a gradual decline. Eric Weinstein, how do I put this? Well, people started to see him as a bit of a crank, as he honestly is, and how he honestly probably always was. One article that kind of goes into the history of this is by Carefulness on Medium. It says, "I was a fan of Eric Weinstein. Now he's threatening me on Twitter." So, like, a natural community schism kind of erupted. Basically, Eric Weinstein is a bit of a crank. He trusts all the wrong people. He always feels himself embattled. He has delusions of grandeur. I mean, I would link you to this one example of him talking on Clubhouse with someone and trying to, like, the way he addressed the criticism he was getting, which is terrible. I can't happen to find the video, though. It was probably deleted. One time, Eric told the story of his university years. I'll admit, I found the story quite compelling when he first told it online in this private community. And the gist is, he claims he was wronged in all sorts of various ways throughout his academic career. And as a result, he is so disillusioned from academia that he refuses to work within the system. He was excluded from things. They made it harder for him to get his degree. He was subject to targeting efforts. People took credit for his work, didn't give him proper recognition, the whole shebang, right? That's all he claims. But as Eric mentioned the events in more and more interviews, it started to become clear that this story, these events in his academic life, it still plays a formative role in his self-identity. And one moment it kind of hit me. Eric Weinstein is 60, and he's still complaining about his years in college. And that, if you ask me, is kind of cringe. If you were shafted in college, consider it a fun war story. You should want that to happen. I mean, at first, when he told it, I thought he was telling it as a cute war story. But it turned out not to be the case. It's an ongoing grievance for him, which it should not be. You should expect to be fucked over in many ways, in many times in your life, by all sorts of different people and organizations imaginable. You should expect that in the same way you expect bad weather. Those are things that add color to your life and form the basis of those college admissions essays, those I overcame stories, which in our current culture are commodities, whether we like it or not. Part 5. Life Failure Inflection Point. Let me start off this section by saying that almost everyone is either unambitious, starry-eyed, or bitter. So, unambitious people don't have very radical goals. Almost no one will ever live up to the full realization of ambitious goals, and their solution is to be unambitious and to not expect much from themselves in the first place. They are resigned to live the life of aesthetics. Second group, starry-eyed people, convince themselves that great success is just around the corner. They are just one big break away from accomplishing all of their hopes and dreams. In reality, they're obviously deluding themselves. The third group is bitter people. They have reached the point in their life where they realize that any chance that they once had to accomplish their hopes and dreams is now mostly gone. They live life in the past. They have rose-tinted glasses for their glory days back when they still had a shot at greatness, forever bitter about how they were supposedly shafted. You have probably met someone who can't stop reminiscing about their high school days, telling you, "I could have become pro if it hadn't been for my knee injury. I could have gone pro dude if it hadn't been for my back injury," something like that. This is the if only person. The bitter person's version of the past is marked by then a semi-paradoxical mix of yearning yet regret. And there's a specific age, different for each ambitious person, where they transform from starry-eyed to bitter. This is a time when their hopes and dreams evaporate and are revealed to be fleetingly unrealistic. I call this the life failure inflection point. Starry-eyed people want to delay this as long as possible. They always convince themselves there's still more time. Certainly, at some point, for instance, there's a kind of mini life failure inflection point when you could no longer say, "What I did was impressive for a kid," but that's fine. That was cope anyway for not living up to the standards of adults. But there's a later, bigger one when you kind of have been in the real world for a while and you realize you couldn't accomplish what you really planned on doing when you were a kid. Me personally, there's no way I could ever bring myself to be unambitious, and I would rather be dead than be better. So this just leaves starry-eyed, which itself has serious problems, but I see it as the only option. I mean, by all means, try to have realistic expectations, but err on the side of avoiding the trap of unambition. Okay, part 6 is extreme ownership. So I'll start with the example of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was thrown in a prison camp, and he could have said, Alexander Solzhenitsyn could have said, "Oh, I've had such terrible luck. There is nothing to be done. I cannot go against the entire system, against the entire ideology. I can't take down the whole nation of the Soviet Union." But instead, he pretty much did that. He discredited the ideology that wronged him, and in doing so, he helped to take down his nation. It's not always your fault when bad things happen to you, but it's your fault if you don't do anything about it. No matter how unsurmountable it is in theory possible to do something about it, which is actually effective. Famous podcast world masculine guy, Navy SEAL, Jocko Willink. You've heard of him. He has a book which I haven't read, but I get the gist, called Extreme Ownership. The concept of extreme ownership is basically that the best leaders must always take ultimate accountability for everything that happens to their team. Blaming incompetent subordinates is not a valid option. If you are a true leader, the buck stops with you. You are completely responsible for your subordinates. Within the rules of your organization, you have to do some combination of 1, select competent people for your team, 2, train and mentor people so they become competent, 3, create and delegate tasks so that people are given work appropriate for them, and 4, have correct expectations. And if your team fails your expectations, you failed in one of those 4 areas, almost by definition. I broadly support this. It reminds me of the adage that the captain should always go down with his ship. I was once debating with someone who said, "Why should the captain go down with his ship? Why lose good captains when it's not their fault?" And the thing is, I think what he said was technically right in some cases, because it's not always their fault. But the problem is we can't distinguish between when it is and it isn't their fault. So we have to always treat it like it is. Essentially, the purpose of this adage is to create skin in the game, which is to say, to align incentives and align disincentives. The disincentive is when your ship goes down, you go down. So you don't want your ship to go down if you're the captain. You're making one person in charge of the endeavor and bear all the costs of the failure, and you kind of have to make someone responsible. Otherwise, no one's responsible. So the best way to do it is to make the leader, the one person in charge, fully responsible. Because you don't want a leader to say, I'm not going to account for random luck because random luck is not my fault, so I'm not going to account for it. I mean, it's possible there is some random luck they can account for. They cannot, but you don't know that. So you have to treat it like they can account for all random luck, and then they will discover what the maximum amount of random luck that they can account for. If the captain assumes everything is their fault, they will find a way to exercise control over things that you thought they couldn't. The U.S. Navy has essentially the position seemingly inspired by this doctrine. According to the U.S. Navy, a ship's captain is always responsible for a maritime accident, regardless of if it's actually their fault. They cannot appeal to bad luck or poor staff or whatever. All that stuff is their fault. There is a class of belief which has been called in the past metaphorical truth, but which in this context I'll just call consequentialist truth. A consequentialist truth is something that you should believe because it leads to good outcomes. A consequentialist truth is not necessarily factually or scientifically a true statement, as in descriptive. Instead, it's more prescriptive. It's a way to phrase advice in such a way that it sounds descriptive, but it's really more like a statement that functions as advice. So a captain should go down with his ship is technically a prescriptive statement. It's an odd claim, but it seems to imply a kind of factual claim. It seems to imply a captain is always responsible for a sinking ship. But that's a consequentialist truth. It's not technically true that a captain is always responsible for his sinking ship, but the prescriptive claim is that a captain should always be treated that way. And I think that leads to good outcomes. Next section, the loser mindset. When I hear people say, she's out of my league, this is above my pay grade, I'm no good at math, these are, I think, examples of the loser mindset. The biggest example of the loser mindset is the idea comparison is the thief of joy. I think you must compare yourself to others in order to properly contextualize your own progress. You will have no idea if you are progressing quickly or slowly if you can't have some frame of reference for comparison of how others are progressing. Somebody is dating the girls you want to, and the fact that it's not you should piss you off. Somebody has the job you want, and the fact that it's not you should piss you off. It's okay to not want to be good at math, for instance, but you should not resign yourself, oh, I'm not good at math, in such a way where you're saying it's like you have no control over it. You're just inherently no good at math. Barring biological and physiological limits, you should, in theory, be able to acquire any skill. Shifting away, I always think people have kind of a loser mindset when they talk about this concept of trauma. I mean, I think the whole concept of being obsessed with trauma is just a net harm for mankind. Like, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you ruminate on trauma, the more you make it bad for you. So, like, we have types of therapy that teach people to see every event in their life through the lens of, oh, that was trauma, and, bad things happened to me, and therefore I'm forever affected by that because trauma is my handicap. And then the problem is they're accepting that frame and they're making it true specifically in their own case, and it need not be true. Okay, section 8. The most evil possible position, or more neutrally named, the most right-wing possible position. The position is personal accountability taken to the most extreme extent, essentially victim blaming, but unapologetically. We will imagine there is no such thing as luck in this framework. We will further imagine that circumstances of birth are not an excuse, essentially that there's no good or bad luck with respect to a birth situation either. This is the equivalent of the religious idea that good or bad things happen to you because it's the will of God who punishes you or rewards you for your success. So under this framework, if a bad thing happens to you, it's your fault no matter what. So, did you get mugged? Your fault. You shouldn't have been in the town where you couldn't defend yourself. Did your friend betray you? Your fault. You should have gotten better friends. Did your spouse divorce you? Your fault. The same logic as before. Did you get stabbed? Your fault. You should have had better martial arts skills. Did you accidentally get a girl pregnant? Well, your fault. You should have been more careful. Did you get a disease? Your fault. You should have lived a more healthy lifestyle. Do you have a genetic disease? Well, it's your parents' fault. They should have known and accepted that possibility. Why complain about something when you took actions that you knew might cause it? Well, as for you, it actually does suck, but just feel lucky that you were even born, because the alternative, think about it, the alternative to not having the genetic defect is that combination of genes was never created, in which case your parents never conceive, you were never born, so at least be lucky that you're alive. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. I like that quote. That's a Shakespeare quote. Of course, Mr. John Green decided to write his book, The Fault in Our Stars, kind of as a parody of this. He says, well, actually, sometimes people do get cancer because, the fault is in our stars. And the Shakespeare character is saying there's not fault. You get it. But I like this quote unironically. I think for the purpose of this framework, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. if you want to talk about group outcomes, okay, the previous part I was talking about individual, getting a disease, individual outcomes, but the same logic applies to group outcomes. Now, individualist, they might not want to talk about group outcomes at all. If you're an individualist, you can just ignore this next part then. But if you do want to talk about groups, then I will say that many groups have grievances against other groups, like we have been wronged, we deserve reparations, but this is an admission of failure, really. If your group was able to stand up for itself, why did they allow themselves to be taken advantage of by failing to take adequate measures to protect themselves? Under the following framework, if something bad happens to your group, then the same logic applies. It's always your group's fault. So, examples of that. Did your tribe get massacred? Their fault. They should have been better at combat. What if they were better at combat and they just had a smaller population? Still their fault. They should have gotten a bigger population if that was required to continue their existence. What if their invaders came from a continent they didn't know existed? Still their fault. They should have been prepared for that. They should have explored more to know the threats. What if you were just so generous that you were not prepared for evil foreigners? Still their fault. They should have not been so gullible. They should have been aware of what kind of evil exists in the world and prepared accordingly. Okay, what about geography, right? Well, as the epic genius Jared Diamond tells us, geography is the only thing that allows groups to dominate other groups, right? According to Jared Diamond. Well, that's still the fault of the invaded. They should have picked better geography. But how could they possibly know? That's just stupid. Human migration is opportunistic and sporadic. There's no way ancient migrating tribes could have possibly predicted what their future geography would be. I know, but didn't you listen to the preface that I said? I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm not necessarily believing this, but let's just assume that they could pick their geography for the purpose of the consequentialist truth. I actually find this philosophy quite useful, albeit insofar as it's incorrect, it's still useful, at least as a way to think about oneself or yourself, because it avoids the victim mentality entirely. One is essentially saying, here's a way to reframe it: I have the potential to be the most competent being in the universe, a being which can surpass any bad luck and any poor circumstances. Therefore, any inability on my part to achieve any of my objectives is simply an indication of a failure to take the appropriate actions that I should take if I was really serious about getting what I want.
Part 9.
Values versus tools. So there's this type of argument that I see sometimes to kind of troll people. You go to 4chan and you say, hey, people on 4chan, I see that you're super xenophobic. But this other culture that you're apparently so xenophobic for, they're actually very similar to you, don't you know? They too are xenophobic. And furthermore, this other culture is conservative in the old-fashioned sense. They're politically based, you could say, even oppressive in some of the same ways that you are. So you are anti-liberal, they are anti-liberal. Now, this argument has always struck me as totally backwards, and not that it's directed at me, but if I was xenophobic, I would find this argument completely backwards. Imagine telling a soldier, you should love the opposing army. Your army has machine guns, their army has machine guns. Your army has artillery, their army has artillery. Your army has tanks, their army has tanks. In fact, their tanks are quite a bit better than yours. I know from your behavior that you value tanks. Given your values and your preference for tanks, you should prefer the army that has bigger tanks because they better embody your values. No, your valuation of tanks does not spring from some platonic void. It is based on the aggressive ability of tanks, on their combativeness, the ability to destroy the enemy. So tanks are a tool to do so, and they would not be needed otherwise. So your core impetus is not for any tool, but for simple in-group preference, wanting your side to dominate over their side. Don't confuse values with tools. If people use the same tools as each other, this is utility, not unity. It is hypocritical to criticize people for having the same values as you, fair enough, but it's not hypocritical to criticize people when they use the same tools or weapons as your side does. Part 10. The value of hypocrisy. Okay, on the other hand, the entire concept of hypocrisy, as I've described it, may be flawed. This part may be difficult to agree or follow with, but I'll try to describe it as best I can. So, first of all, debate is premised on the assumption that what makes one side better than the other side is the ability to argue their position logically. If you can make a successful deontological argument that your values are superior, then you win. So, okay, so far so good. But clearly, it does not follow that the better side in an argument will always win in the real world because of self-interest. People don't always do what the best argument says they should do. Self-interest, in the sense of valuing oneself over others, is just a natural human tendency, and it's what really guides decisions in most cases. As individuals, we want to get better grades than our peers. We want to be more popular than our peers. We want to have more money than our peers. This is a natural competitive instinct that most people have, even if you say you don't. And you can always take the moral high ground. But are you really willing to settle for less than people who are more scheming than you are? And it's easy to answer, yes, of course I would. But talk is cheap, and when it comes down to it, most people don't really act out that value if they're being completely honest with themselves. And this is actually the best way to describe the behavior of large groups. Especially as groups and nations, we are tribal, in-group loyal. We want more land than our competitors, more cultural influence, more economic influence, and so on and so on. How do you justify this with debate, that I should have more than you just because I deserve more? I mean, you can't really. People try to use debates, but it's a pretext. People say my side is better than their side, not because of some Kantian absolutist principle that puts them in the right. It's just a power struggle, ultimately. So this creates an apparent hypocrisy of people criticizing their opponents for what they themselves do. But I grant a level of inevitability to this process, and if you do so, then really, at a certain level, the only good position becomes one we might call hypocritical. Forget deontology and think about self-interest. When you fall in love with someone's girlfriend and steal her away, you think that is good because it benefits you. When some other guy falls in love with your girlfriend and steals her away, you think that's bad because it hurts you. You hate others for doing the same thing that you do yourself, and of course you do. When they do it, it hurts you. When you do it, it helps you. Given the preface of this video, here's how I reconcile the devil's advocate position that I've been arguing with, generally speaking, what I really think. I will posit the following. If you, as a person or group, are either severely unlucky or legitimately wronged, then you have every right to be upset and point out the injustice, and if and only if my help would actually nullify your complaint to fix your problem, you also have every right to request aid from me to remediate the grievance, although whether I'm actually obligated to help you depends on whether I'm at fault, otherwise it's up to me. But, barring those conditions, you are not entitled to my empathy. Do not necessarily expect empathy from me. Did your village get raided? Did locusts eat your crops? Are you being oppressed? Well, I can help, and I will side with you. But you're not entitled to my empathy, and you shouldn't want it either. I feel empathy like everyone else, but at the end of the day, that is not what is going to actually help you. In fact, my empathy only really helps me, because it allows me to virtue signal. And I don't dream of eliminating privilege either, by the way, because I don't think that's possible. If you've gotten this far in the video, then like and subscribe.